This is a FarmDoc webinar. I'm University of Illinois Extension farm broadcaster Todd Gleason. Over the next hour, we'll journey along with, I'll call them, 4 emissaries from the University of Illinois to the South American nation of Brazil. They spent 12 days in the month of May 2023 touring the breadth of agriculture there and presenting the FarmDoc story to that nation. They began in Sao Paulo at the University of Sao Paulo and then made their way northward into Mato Grosso and the farming regions that are rich in soybean, cotton, and corn. At each stop along the way, they talked about the FarmDoc mission and extension and how the University of Illinois is reaching out to producers and others with agricultural economic information that can be put into use on the farm directly. Joana Colussi led the team and organized the trip that included Gary Schnitkey and Nick Paulson, along with Eric Morgan. You'll hear from all of them today. They made stops at the Agri-Show, one of the largest agricultural showcases on the planet. It is operated by the same people that put on the Farm Progress Show here in the United States. They also toured ethanol plants and farms and businesses and saw just how much pasture land was yet to come into production. We'll explore all of that today in this FarmDoc webinar, FarmDoc in Brazil. Now, here's Joana Colussi.
Thanks for the excellent intro video, Todd, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to be here. I'm very happy to talk about our trip to Brazil in South America. The FarmDoc team had a really good time in those 2 weeks from May 1st to May 12th. We traveled over 2,000 miles from São Paulo in the southeast through Goiás and Mato Grosso in the central west of Brazil. Brazil is a huge country like the United States. So we traveled to Brazil as part of a research project on technology adoption among farmers, sponsored by the Lehman Center from Brazilian Studies at the University of Illinois. So thank you so much, Lehman Center, for this sponsor us in this amazing trip. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm going to start by presenting an overview of the Brazilian Center-West, made up of 3 states, Mato Grosso, next slide please, Goiás, and Mato Grosso do Sul. These 3, Mato Grosso, Goiás, and Mato Grosso do Sul, are responsible for almost half of the total grain production in Brazil. Most of the areas in this region are covered by the Brazilian savanna, or the Cerrado. Cerrado is responsible for more than 70% of Brazil's agriculture production. Now, look the numbers just regarding Mato Grosso, the largest soybean, corn, cotton, and beef producer in Brazil. We visit 5 cities there. First, Cocaminho, second, Lucas do Rio Verde, after Sinop, Sapezal, and finally Cuiabá, the capital of Mato Grosso. The state of Mato Grosso represented 30% of the Brazilian soybean production in the last crop season, with 28 million acres, according to the data from the Brazilian government. But despite all this relevance in agriculture, Mato Grosso uses only 13% of its area for crop production and 25% for pasture. Around 60% of Mato Grosso's land is made up of areas preserved by farmers for legal reasons, indigenous land, and conservation units. There are 2 biomes in Mato Grosso, Cerrado and Amazonian rainforest. For each one, Cerrado and Amazon, there is one specific land preservation law. Professor Eric Morgan will explain this in more detail in a few minutes. So looking at the land use and the occupation in Mato Grosso, we can see that there is the possibility to double the crop land for the next decade, for example. In the next slide, we can see the soybean production. So here is actually cotton, but some numbers regarding soybean production. The state may have an average annual increase of 4%, which are projected 41 million acres, according to data from the Mato Grosso Institute of Agriculture Economics. We went in this institute last Friday in the city of Cuiabá. By the way, thanks for sharing this number with us. This increase in the next decade represent an extra of 15 million acres of soybeans, mostly from the conversion of pasture areas to crops. Next slide, please. We can see, for example, in this town, in Cocalinho, next slide, just for, yes, in this town, in Mato Grosso, for example, just on this farm from the Ouro Verde group, almost 2,000 acres of land area opening for the next crop season. All these areas were degraded pasture land in the past, and now will be occupied by crops. Now, let's see the numbers regarding corn production in Mato Grosso. Next slide, please. Corn is the second main crop planted in Mato Grosso after the soybean harvest. The state is the largest corn producer in Brazil, represents 39% of corn production in the country. Over the next 10 years, Mato Grosso can increase its area by 62%, reaching 29 million acres. This additional 11 million acres will be planted in the second crop, actually corn after soybeans. Most of the crops that we saw in Mato Grosso on our trip are corn planted in January or in February during the wet season. The next slide, please. From now until the harvest in July, the corn will receive almost zero rain because of the dry season in the region, which is usually from May to September. In this picture, we can see a farm from the Ferrarin group who have planted around 150,000 acres of corn as a second crop in the current season. They will start the harvest probably in the end of June, beginning of the July. The great increase of corn as a second crop is the main reason for the expansion in ethanol corn industries in Mato Grosso over the last few years. In 2022 crop season, for example, Brazil produced 4.5 billion liters of corn ethanol, an amount that represents 14% of all ethanol produced in the country. The forecast is to reach 10 billion liters of corn ethanol by 2030. Currently, there are 18 corn ethanol plants in the states of Mato Grosso, Mato Grosso do Sul, Goiás, and São Paulo. There are also 10 other projects under construction in the region. So during our trip, we went to the FS Bioenergy in the city of Lucas do Rio Verde in central Mato Grosso. FS was the first Brazilian industry to produce ethanol from corn in 2017. FS is a joint venture between Tapajós Participações from Brazil and the Summit Agriculture Group from Iowa in the United States. The company has two facilities in Mato Grosso, in the towns of Lucas do Rio Verde and Sorriso. They have started construction on a third facility in Primavera do Leste, in Mato Grosso. So in summary, we can see there is a potential for agriculture expansion in the state of Mato Grosso and other regions as well. However, there are some limitations regarding infrastructure, especially logistical challenges and environmental restrictions to open new areas in Brazil. Here is Professor Eric Morgan to talk more about these topics. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Todd, for the wonderful video and getting us started today. My name is Eric Morgan. I'm an associate professor in the Agricultural Communications program here at the University of Illinois, also a member of the Department of Natural Resource and Environmental Science. It was a real honor to be able to go on this trip with the team and learn about the story of agriculture in Brazil. And certainly Brazil's story is a compelling one. Today, I would like to share at least 4 things that I heard over the course of the trip. Maybe 4 things that folks are talking about, things that really shape and drive the what Brazilian agriculture is at this point. So to start off with, Joanna mentioned this. The reason I'm starting is because it was our first meeting, our first official meeting of the trip, and we were able to visit a small group that's associated with the University of Sao Paulo's School of Agriculture, the Luiz de Queiroz School of Agriculture. And this small group is Log, and they do logistical analysis for the environmental sector. Now, when I was listening to this, it was very interesting, and certainly, telling the story of something that's a key concern for all agricultural production. But it didn't really become real, or I guess it was made more real when we were able to make our way into the Center West. So the story of logistics, of course, is an old one, how to get goods from farm to market. Well, in Brazil, with its rapid expansion of the agricultural sector, we see that this logistical situation it takes on more importance. So you see here a red line, which is actually the soybean highway, Brazil 163. I won't talk much about that because I think it'll be talked about a little bit later. But just to note here, it's a very long road. It goes from the state of Pará all the way in the north, all the way to the south to get grains to port. The interesting thing, of course, is that this is a 2-lane highway where we were. And so if things happen, and all grain is transported by truck. And so if things happen, and things do happen quite frequently, just given the volume of traffic, it shuts everything down. And so we're seeing some images here. So logistics is one of those themes. Another theme is innovation. Innovation and technology and the celebration of that. As was mentioned before, we were fortunate to go to the Agri Show, one of the largest agricultural shows in the world. And of course, those shows are all about the latest and greatest. I have here an image which you can see in Portuguese says "New Times, New Solutions." This is from Jacto, which is a Brazilian farm equipment company. Even though this show was a celebration of that, and we had all the players there: John Deere, New Holland, Case, Jacto, Horst, others as well. It wasn't just at this one event that technology and innovation is a key driving factor in Brazilian agriculture. In fact, we were able to visit also the what we'd call a startup incubator. And this was at the beginning of the trip, and again at the end of the trip, we see that there's a real focus on trying to develop technological digital solutions to problems facing producers in Brazil. And so the Ag Tech Garage was a particularly interesting space. It brings together, again, some big corporations, such as some that are familiar to us, Bayer, Corteva, to partner with other smaller groups. So there were folks who were working on carbon markets, groups that were working on biodiversity and land use preservation in the Brazilian context. We also had an opportunity to visit with Gustavo on the next slide, who runs their own startup incubator for Raízen, which is the largest sugarcane processing company in the world. So Gustavo took us through his process that he used to try to partner smaller entrepreneurs, smaller startups with larger operators to solve solutions. So we see these 2 features: technology, innovation, and diffusion of innovation, and logistics. Those are similar and familiar to us. Perhaps another thing, though, that I found particularly interesting, driving the conversation about agriculture in Brazil is something that Joanna mentioned before, and that's the legal reserve requirement. The legal reserve requirement is a unique feature of Brazilian land use that was started way back in 1965 initially with the passage of the Forest Code. What this does is it's an attempt to try to preserve native vegetation and biodiversity within the Amazon or within Brazil, within the entire Brazilian context. So as we know, the Amazon is predominantly located, the Amazon basin is predominantly located in Brazil. And so from Brazil's perspective and from a global perspective, there's a lot of interest in preserving this key ecological resource. And so this legal reserve requires, on the next slide, we can see here again, requires that landowners preserve a certain percentage of their land holdings as native vegetation. And this percentage can vary depending on where one lives. Joanna mentioned that there's at least two biomes in Mato Grosso, the Amazon and the savanna or the Cerrado. In the Amazon, up to 80% of land is required to be preserved. So you can imagine that if you're a landowner or a producer, that preserving 80% of that can create some challenges. In the savanna, that percentage is a little bit lower, 20%, and in transition areas, it can be up to 35%. And there's some technical things with how that changes and what can be converted and when. But what's really interesting, and the reason I wanted to bring this up is because it's a unique feature of Brazilian conservation strategy. And it's also a part of the story about conservation that doesn't, and sustainable farming practices that doesn't get told very often in the context of Brazil. So for example, we oftentimes hear about rampant deforestation and illegal practices associated with Brazil, and that gets amplified in global media circles. But yet we have this unique decades-old effort on the part of Brazil to preserve the land and the biodiversity there. And you can see here the 60.6% of all land in Mato Grosso is protected. So that particular feature was another key part of the story. And then the final part of the story, I think there's some images next of just some of the legal reserve in the background. As you can see some emus there and some cattle. But another key part of the story is about sustainable practices in farming. And we were able to visit with the Schaefer Group and Guilherme Schaefer, who has really dedicated a lot of effort into using biologicals, particularly biological inoculants, and cultivating bacteria for application on fields in order to increase yields, to function as pesticides, to fix nitrogen, et cetera. And so this is another key theme of the story. And so it was a lot of fun to identify these. Obviously, there's a whole bunch more that we could talk about and that we could listen to. So, but at that, I'll turn it over to Nick, who will talk about a few other things. So, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Eric. As it always works out, we did test runs, but my webcam is not cooperating like it was yesterday when we tested this out. So apologize for that, but as long as you can hear me, we can go through the few points that I wanted to raise. So the first thing I want to talk about is just some of the outcomes of the associated with the scale of the operations that we visited. Now, I don't think we necessarily visited what one might call representative farms, but I think we're all very well aware. We've heard that farms in this part of the world are bigger than what we're used to here in the Midwest. Again, the 4 farms that we visited probably were more on the cutting edge. Examples of highly innovative operations. So again, not that every farm is like this, but I think there are plenty of examples of other farms that we didn't visit that are also operating at this scale, 20,000 to 100,000 plus hectares, or 50,000 to 250 or 300,000 acres. And one of the things that I noticed on all 4 of the farms that we visited was the farmer, what we think of as a farmer here in the Midwest is a little bit different role when you get to be that size. And at that point, the farmer really takes on the CEO role. And they're not, I think the farmers we talk to, and definitely the next generation that we talk to on the operations that we saw, they maybe have never driven a tractor in their life. So they are in the boardroom, so to speak, making management decisions, working with their management team, developing relationships on the marketing side, and again, operating much more as the CEO of a decent sized business. And the mentality behind that, I think, is also something that I noticed a bit different from what we might see from your typical Midwestern farmer growing grain, corn and soybeans here in the Midwest. At least two of the farmers that we met with, they didn't talk about. We asked them, but if we hadn't asked them, they wouldn't have even mentioned yields. They're much more focused on margins, EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So again, much more general business-oriented measures of financial performance and financial success. And if they could earn the highest margin by adopting practices that resulted in lower yields, but maybe higher prices or lower costs, they would pursue those things, and they were pursuing those things in a number of the examples that we saw. Related to that, again, given the scale, these operations were able to sort of leverage things that smaller farms can't, and so we saw a lot of vertical integration on these operations. Everywhere from the farmer on down through the hierarchy down to kind of the field workers or the machine operators. Within that staff hierarchy, they had their own in-house agronomists. The scale of these operations also allowed for a lot of what we would think is pretty large scale on-farm experimentation and research, and feeding that research back into the management and agronomic practices that they were utilizing within their cropping systems in future years. Some really impressive stuff there. In the pictures, you can see doing some research there in a cotton field on the top, and they had pulled the leaves off a small plot here just to see, just to count some bolls on plants, just to see how this small research plot, which was probably like 20 hectares or something like that, how it was reacting to the treatment in that area. And then at the bottom, this is the Schaefer group, one of our last stops. This is a lab, a picture taken in their biologics lab, where they're within the operation in partnership with Syngenta, I believe, developing their own biologics, propagating them, experimenting with them, and then utilizing them, and with the goal of getting much closer to 100% adoption with the use of practices like that. And then the last 2 points, they're sort of outcomes of the large scale. The large scale of these operations actually provides some risk management through diversification. So a lot of these operations were divided up into smaller units with individual farm managers overseeing those units, and they may be spread out in a geographic area such that you could count on, if one area experienced a drier than usual wet season, maybe one of the other units is probably going to offset that with better growing conditions. And then the last one, again, just sort of a way to combat the logistics issues that Eric alluded to. Again, the scale of these operations sort of allows them to bring a lot of logistics issues in-house. One of the farmers we visited, one of the operations focused on non-GMO soybean production. So they had basically completely developed their supply chain to keep those non-GMO beans segregated from when they're harvested in those fields all the way through to when they hit the port to be shipped to markets that they had directly developed in Europe. Another example was the Schaefer group. Again, probably the largest operation that we saw. They basically offered to go 50-50 with the government to put in a paved highway just to improve the logistics situation in their area. Something that would be much harder to do if you were trying to coordinate a large number of smaller farms, but with these big farms, it was something that a logistics challenge that they could meet head on because of their scale. The next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the labor issues. Was sort of a theme that came up, something we asked about. I think challenges that a lot of farms in the U.S. face as well. And I think a lot of similarities here on the labor side about challenges of identifying workers related to where the workers are located, much like here in the U.S., where we see more and more people going to urban areas, fewer people in rural areas, dealing with those same challenges. Education is probably something I would say that the U.S. still has an advantage in. Both the public kind of primary education systems in Brazil, I think all the way through the university systems, it was something people noted could be improved to provide better trained workers for the agricultural industry. And then even for some of the roles in these operations that don't necessarily require a formal degree, agriculture is very tech oriented now. And so, even some of the things like driving tractors, operating combines requires some pretty specialized training. And so trying to find ways to access that training for their workers, bring it in-house in a lot of cases because of their size, being able to do that. And then the last point on the labor issue, again, I think something that we're all very familiar with here too, is just more people in cities, fewer people in rural areas. Kind of a widening disconnect between, people really understanding where their food comes from, and just how production agriculture works and the knowledge and perception around that. Another issue then that we asked everybody, a big issue here with the stakeholders we work with in the Midwest, is how farmers actually control the farmland that they operate. Found out that lease arrangements do play a big role for a lot of these operations. The farms we visited rented a significant amount of land. I think one of the operations rented 80+% of the land that they operated. They had expanded through leasing additional land over the last decade. And a really interesting thing we found out here was that the lease arrangements are pretty much all paid based on a fixed production rent. So here in the Midwest, we have fixed cash rents, we have share rents, we have hybrid variable cash leases that are kind of a combination of those two. In Brazil, it seems like most of the rental arrangements are literally paid in a fixed amount of production per hectare that is paid on that land. And most of those rental arrangements, if not all of them, are denominated in soybeans. So you don't pay a certain number of dollars per hectare or a certain number of reais per hectare. You pay a certain volume of soybeans per hectare, and that is the fixed piece of the rental arrangement. In most cases, the landowner then chooses when to market those beans. So they translate those beans to value. And it could be that the farmer actually does the physical act of selling the beans, but they do it when the landowner says and at what price they can receive at that time, and then they pay them the equivalent amount of cash. Or there was examples too where they were literally just delivering physical beans to pay the rental contract for the year. I found this very interesting. I thought it was kind of a strange way to structure a lease. One of the implications about this is that you're going to have your highest rent, implied rental value, in your worst production years. So if we think of low production being associated with higher prices in general, you're paying a fixed amount of soybeans regardless of what the overall yield is. And if it's a year where yields are low, prices might be high, and the landowner's going to get a higher rent in dollar value. And then in bumper crop years, when prices tend to be lower, again, you're still paying that fixed amount of production. They'll market that at a lower price, and the rental payment will actually be smaller. So we asked a little bit about that, but again, kind of the rationale behind it is, one, this is how they've always done it, and how people are used to operating in lease arrangements in Brazil, and then also just kind of noted the lack of variability in production There's basically a very low likelihood or almost a 0% chance they wouldn't produce enough soybeans to at least cover the rental payment for that year. So that was sort of the mentality that they approached these lease arrangements with. And then the final point, I was just going to talk a little bit about crop insurance. Again, something that's obviously very important in the U.S. We've got a very good, highly subsidized, high participation rate program. Much different situation in Brazil. So there is crop insurance available, but it is focused on smaller farm operations. And again, when I say smaller, that's a relative thing. Smaller than the farms that we visited. It is very expensive, partially because it's not subsidized. So they are having to pay the full private cost of the insurance. And another big difference is that the insurance programs available there don't cover yields, don't cover revenues like we have here in the US. They actually guarantee a percent of the farmer's cost of production. So the level of insurance, the amount of liability that can be insured is also going to be lower than if we compare it to the US system. And when you put all those factors together, maybe unsurprisingly, there's a very low participation rate in the crop insurance program in Brazil. I think we were told that less than 10% of the hectares in production are actually covered by insurance. And again, those are going to be on your smaller farms. The bigger farms tended to just self-insure using, combination of financial strategies as well as geographic diversification in terms of how their operations were spread out. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Gary, and he'll wrap up with a few concluding points for the morning.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And this is me standing out by the way, in a cotton field. It is not a soybean field. It is a cotton field. I would also like to thank the Lehman Center for providing funding for this trip and for Joana for organizing it and making it a great trip. I'm going to cover 2 points and then briefly look at each one of the 4 farming operations that we had the opportunity to visit. The first point is that we haven't seen the end of expansion in Brazil. And we saw this figure before. 7.8% of the land in Brazil is in crops, and they have a large amount of pasture that they can transfer over into crops, and that is in fact what is happening to a large extent in Mato Grosso and elsewhere. Pastures or degraded pastures are being converted into crops because crops have a higher return than beef production on pasture. That we heard twice they could expand crop production by 2 times the amount that they currently produce just by converting pasture. So if we're anticipating that there's a near end to Brazil's expansion, that isn't the case, and we will see them grow, and they already are the #1 soybean producer, and will continue to widen that gap, and likely also continue to do that into the foreseeable future. Again, what we're seeing there is the conversion of pasture to cropland. This here is part of that process. This is one of the farms, the second farm we visited, and they're converting a lot of their pastures. And we heard 4,000 acres for the coming year from pasture to cropland. Again, this is the close to the end result. They've just broken up the soil. You can see it's a red soil, and that process again will continue. This particular group had some financial difficulties back in the 5-6 years ago, and part of the solution for that was converting pasture to cropland. It was sort of interesting to also look at their financial statements. They had a lot of graphical sort of views of that, and we're running that through Power VBA. The second thing that I want to mention is that logistics is a problem, and we continually heard about that. This again is the soybean highway. This is a picture of that highway while we were there. And just note that this highway is full now, and we aren't in a harvest season. So it's hard to get your mind around the fact that in Mato Grosso, most of the soybeans move on 2-lane highways like this one. And once you get off those 2-lane highways, the roads get much, much worse. Again, that situation is going to get better over time. That will make Brazil more competitive with the United States. And again, we can continue to expect to see that in the future. So there's still a large potential of expansion of farmland in Brazil, and there's also a large potential expansion of their infrastructure, all of which will bring them more into the agricultural picture, make them more of a superpower in that agricultural picture. The first farm we visited was near São Paulo, the Rodrigues family. One of the things that we note about all 4 of the farmers we visited is that their operations are relatively young. By that I mean they didn't get their start. The Rodrigues family was in São Paulo. This happened to be a sugarcane operation primarily, and they were using rotations between sugarcane to enhance soils. But it was a sugarcane operation that actually began with their farm in roughly the 1940s. And in fact, their land before they had it was in coffee production. His father, or Pablo's father, came over from came up here and purchased the land after working on that operation for a while. This operation was impressive in the amount of financial and controls they had on their operation. They thought about having an agricultural plan, which was laying out all their field operations for the year, then moving that agricultural plan into cash flow and finally into financial statements. They had a board of directors, and they also had one outside board of director on that. That happened to be Carlos Ortiz, who was very instrumental in arranging or helping Joana arrange the farmers that we saw during that trip. Again, professionalism in their management was one of the keys of this operation. Another group we mentioned was the Farran group, which was in the center of Mato Grosso. This operation again began, as most operations in Mato Grosso began in the 1980s and 1990s. Before that, Mato Grosso was primarily a pasture, cattle producing area, and we saw that area grow into the soybeans and now corn that we're seeing that grow into. That area was identified as an area, or Mato Grosso was an area that was identified as an area that could expand in crop production. Much of the reason why it could expand was the research in making soybean production adaptable to the Cerro Gordo or the savanna regions, and making soybean production work in a tropical climate. The Farran group farms 68,000 hectares, roughly 150,000 acres. The CEO is in the Illinois hat there with the book. He's next to Joana. And this again he was the first one that broke the land into cropland. He told a story of 1 year of having to sell his car to buy diesel fuel to plant the crop. So there was a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of risk. And again, we saw the operations that survived. His two of his sons are there. One of them has the arm around him, and the other one is on the green side. Again, one of the technologies that this group used a lot of was tracking of the equipment in the field. And if you think about 150,000 acres, and it's important to remember also that they do their soybean harvest in January and February during the wet season, so they have to find dry land, and they want to plant their second crop corn almost immediately. Another farm we mentioned, visited, was the Giancini group. This was in northern Mato Grosso. They had 25,000 hectares. They rented about 65% of that, and 45% of that was owned. Again, their father started this operation, and Evandro, in this picture on the left, closest to the screen, and Michelangelo, one of his brothers is pictured with him. Junior, another brother, is not pictured with them. This group is very big into non-GMO soybeans, and given that their entire farm is devoted to non-GMO soybeans, and it's interesting to understand why they did that. They believe they can make more money on non-GMO than they can on GMO. They believe they're taking a 15% yield loss. They have higher costs, but they make up for it on margin. Again, relating to Nick's point that it's margins that drive these individuals and not yields. They also have an advantage because their entire farm is in GMOs. They control the supply chain from their farm to their farmer-owned elevators, or the elevators that they own, and then they transport that to the port up that one highway, by the way. So all of that's a difficult part of the operation. The final farm we visited was the Schaefer Group. This is a 160,000 hectare farm, or roughly 500,000 acres. Their primary business is soybeans and cotton. And G. Schaefer, the CEO, says they will sacrifice soybean yields to get cotton in there sooner. They were, again, big on regenerative agriculture, and again, very, very big on control. He showed me his financial statements, which happened to be on a iPhone. He showed those to me while driving on the road very fast. So, but had those things at his fingertips. So again, this was a good experience, and I would note that all these individuals had something that Illinois farmers don't have, and just for Illinois farmers, think about what the size of your operation would be if you could rent all the land you wanted for $200 per acre, and that's what they had. And that led to the large sizes that they now see, and emphasized some of the things that they emphasize, in fact, the large size, and then the management structures that needed to be in place. I again want to thank the Lehman Center, and we'll turn this over to Todd.
Indeed, thanks to the Lehman Center for Brazilian Studies. They're here on campus at lehman.illinois.edu and provided the grant that allowed the FarmDoc team to make that trip to Brazil. We'd also like to thank those who underwrite the FarmDoc website, the FarmDoc team in general. They include the TIA Center for Farmland Research, Compare Financial, Corteva AgriScience, Farm Credit Illinois, Illinois Corn Growers, the Illinois Soybean Association, and FS Growmark. Our educational partners include FBFM, Illinois Extension, and of course, the Department of ACE, Agricultural and Consumer Economics here on campus. We can just bring up everybody's cameras at this point. We'll get back to the end slide in just a bit. We will thank you. But if you've got questions, you can go ahead and type those in. We'll get those answered. There's been a question waiting for a while. And I think, Joanna, probably you'll be able to answer this one fairly effectively, because the current president was president prior to this, Lula da Silva. And then in between those, there was President Bolsonaro. How friendly is the government under these two different administrations to agriculture in Brazil?
Yeah, actually, we received this question, all the opportunities that we had to talk with people. Yes, most of the agribusiness sector, they supported Bolsonaro. It still has some uncomfortable from the agribusiness sector with Lula, but so far we didn't see any change in the Lula's government regarding agriculture. There is a huge concern about what could happen, but so far it's just concern. Lula is less than 6 months since he became president. So far we didn't see any difference, but there is a huge concern around that, especially regarding conservation practices, that we still have a lot of legislation regarding that, some indigenous land areas. But maybe we should wait a little bit more.
Let's talk a little bit about logistics as well. We had some questions about BR 163. That's the road that runs from one end of south end of Brazil to the north end, from one port to the other. I'm not quite certain it makes it all the way to the southern ports, but close enough that it's used as the soybean highway. It was not paved. I think it finally got paved completely in the last 5 years, maybe the last decade, but certainly in the mid 2000s, most of it was not paved at that point. The governor of Brazil at the time, Blairo Maggi, ran and won, I think, on the idea that we would pave our way out of Mato Grosso. And that has happened. So the question really is about logistics and what are the expectations going forward. We got a couple of those. Will the roads continue to be paved? What is railway like, and how are they building out infrastructure in general? And I don't know who among you wants to take that up to begin with.
I'll go ahead, Joanna.
No, I'm just saying that the situation today is much better than in the past. It's not the perfect situation because Brazil has a high dependence of trucks. But in the last years, there were investments in railroads and waterways. Even though in the ports, during the many years, Brazil had a high dependence from the ports in the southeast, in São Paulo and Paraná. But in the last years, the share of the ports in the north of Brazil, in Pará, in Piauí, they helped a lot to transport the soybeans from the center west of Brazil and the northeast, Mato Piba, region. But it's still there is need to improve the condition of the roads and so all the systems in general. But the situation today is much better than in the past.
There are a number of improvements that aren't on the books that they know about. One of them is just making that 2-lane highway a 4-lane, which would considerably help things. That was in the works, then got shut down, and you would think that would happen fairly soon. Just as an aside, while we were on that highway, there was 2 wrecks that we saw, one coming towards us and then one we got caught up in, and we took some dirt roads around that. There is also the development of rails, and those are primarily going to the southern port, and that was going more or less through Sao Paulo, but that would also cut down the highway portion of that. And again, the northern ports, the development of those northern ports are going to be key. I don't see how you can have an agriculture that large and that not happen. And they're still growing, and it is just going to get better. So, and everybody knows that there, but there are political challenges. The other thing that was mentioned a number of times was that where the U.S. has an advantage over Brazil is in infrastructure. We invested in infrastructure in the United States. Brazil is not so much, and on our education system. So,
and just to paint that picture a little bit more, it's kind of interesting. If you think about BR 163, the 2-lane highway, and as it goes through Mato Grosso, Mato Grosso is a state that is 1.5 times bigger than Texas, right? And so that is just one road. Now, granted, it goes through the primary grain production region, but there's grain production all over the state. And so those roads deteriorate significantly outside of that. We actually traveled from Goiânia, which is the capital of Goiás, the state, to Cocalino, which was about 400 kilometers. Is that correct, Joanna?
Yeah.
And maybe 100 kilometers were on a dirt road that was rough. I mean, we were bounced around and got plenty. And you can imagine that during harvest time, that's the majority of the road system. So again, as the improvements continue, and they are continuing with these investments, the situation will ease a little bit.
Yeah, and you can imagine that you were talking about Mato Grosso, that's the largest producer in Brazil. You can imagine the situation in Mato Piba region, for example, the new agriculture frontier in the northeast. I have been there 6 years ago, and I remember it was horrible.
On the Amazon, I know Cargill and ADM both have facilities, port facilities on the Amazon itself. I think, Joanna, you've told me that it is an Atlantic coast port on the north side that is the biggest of the ports there. Those are all investments made by outside firms. Is the issue that they'll have going forward that they need to develop infrastructure nationally so that the domestic numbers have to be developed, and that ports and other things that can be put in by companies has not been the issue at this point?
Yeah, actually, I think the big issue is to have an integration between all the systems. Of course, there are some regions that there is no rivers to have waterways. But for sure, when you talk about long distance, like in Brazil, we can for sure have some integration system. And answer your question, yes, most of the investments that Brazil had in the last years was from private company, big traders, I think. And the last government, they changed some rules looking to avoid this kind of investments in ports and in railroads and roads as well.
And one last infrastructure question that just came in that we should address: how much investment has China made in infrastructure? For instance, we talked on the radio for many years about China investing in railways, but that doesn't seem to have come to fruition.
Yeah, there is investment from China for sure in Brazil in infrastructure, but I don't know how percentage that you represent. I don't know, I guess 20% or something, but for sure there is.
Gary, any insights about regarding the land cost there versus here and marketing equilibriums?
Yeah, just they have much lower land costs than we do here. The Farron Group mentioned that they thought when we did the comparisons, they had roughly half the land costs that we have in the United States. That advantage for them that's an advantage for Mato Grosso. That is going to go away because as their land becomes, they have less pasture to bring on board, they're going to have rising land costs. And in fact, a number of them farmers in Mato Grosso realize that, and they're moving out their operations to the Mato Piba area in Brazil and Colombia. So they have less land, they have less cash rent than we do here. And that is their primary cost advantage. And there's also a question, can Illinois and U.S. compete? Yes, they can. If you look at like fertilizer, seed, and chemicals, we're roughly the same cost. We pay more in seed for soybean production, less in fertilizer, and less in pesticide. If you look at what their labor situation looks like, they have roughly 1 employee per 200 acres, which wouldn't work here. So if anything, but their labor costs are totally different. So yes, the United States can compete, but we have to realize that we have to figure out we have to figure out ways to make that competition to our advantage, to our strengths. And yeah, we can compete with Brazil, but Brazil is going to keep growing. So that's just something to keep in mind if we can compete or not.
Steve Sanka, former ag economist, along with you, had a comment and a question both, noting that 20 years ago, the way to become a farmer was to, and be successful, was to purchase, to have the land. He's wondering whether that's changed today, and that the ratio switched with farming being run as a business rather than just how much land you're able to get hold of.
Yeah, and 20 years ago, you tried to acquire as much land as you could. That they still have less land costs than we do here, but that ticket is over in Mato Grosso, or coming to a rapid end. And yes, they have to act more like a business. In fact, as I was looking at their cost structure, I was thinking we should send some Illinois farmers down there and have them squeak out some lower costs. But you know, they have scale that we don't. But that scale happened because it developed in the 1940s and, or excuse me, 1940s in Sao Paulo and 1980s and 1990s in Mato Grosso. And just think if you had Illinois and nothing here in the 1980s and 1990s, nothing, some pasture land, what Illinois would look like now.
Do we know what percentage of farmland might be foreign owned in Brazil?
I think foreign ownership is allowed, right, Joanna?
Yeah, do you mean the percentage that they honor the land?
Yeah, so how much farmland is owned? For instance, we know there are Illinois farmers who own farmland in Brazil, but how much foreign ownership might there be from China or other places?
Oh, there is restrictions to buy land for international people. It is possible, but with a partnership with Brazilians. So there is, of course, investment, but it's not most of it's a few amount because these restrictions in legislation. Yeah, and even though more restrictions in the frontier, 100 kilometers in distance from frontier, there is higher restrictions regarding to buy land for international investment.
Nick, you made note about the payment system being on sacks of grain for rented land because they could depend on being able to raise a crop. I would think that might be on first crop only as opposed to second crop. And Daryl Good noted that years ago as they were beginning to play on the international stage that they didn't have that much variability. The question, however, is does that provide any insight into Brazil versus U.S. supplies and elasticities?
The lack of, especially when you look at any sort of aggregate production level, you go from the farm to the state level to the country level. I think production is very stable, particularly nationwide when you look at Brazil. So, that would definitely impact supply elasticities. Although, the other thing they have to keep in mind about Brazil, because they have two crops in the season, is they can be pretty nimble in reacting to changing market conditions. So they're most of the farms are focused on growing soybeans in the wet season and then either cotton or corn in the dry season. But they have other crop rotations that they can mix in, which gives them twice as many chances during any given calendar year to adapt to changing market conditions compared with farmers in the U.S.
Joanna, can you remind us in how much of second crop corn Mato Grosso produces? And then I'm going to put that into another question, which is online. How important is corn-based ethanol to the long-term outlook for Brazilians' second crop corn. And one other context, in 2009, the governor of Brazil was here on campus, and what they wanted to do was to go visit an ethanol plant at that time, because their expectation was to build out ethanol plants there.
Yeah, today Mato Grosso represents more than 30% of the corn production in Brazil. Just to remember, Safrinha is more than 75% of the corn production today, the second crop. And these investments in ethanol plants start to happen 10 years ago. The first industry that used just corn for produce ethanol was in 2017, so 5-6 years ago. So it's very recent. And so far, the ethanol by corn represents around 14% of the ethanol production in general in Brazil. Sugarcane is still the first one, the number one, but I mean, there is a huge potential to continue increase. You can just see the investment so far. There are 18 corn ethanol plants in Brazil, and there are other 10 that they are in under construction. So they have this forecast that it is possible to increase a lot the produce of ethanol by corn, especially in the center west of states, Mato Grosso, Goiás, Mato Grosso do Sul, and a little bit in São Paulo as well.
So just a couple of other questions to get to, because we're past the top of the hour now. On the biologicals, Gary, were they widely adopted across every farm you were at, or just at the last farm? And why do you think that's the case there?
I think that was just the last farm. We didn't have here, we didn't specifically ask about biologicals at the other farm. So that was the Schaefer's group. That was their emphasis, and they were working that. And by the way, they're into regenerative agriculture, but they want a return on investment in that, by the way. So they're looking at it in that sort of framework.
And
I think that's really important. Gary's point there was, that the Schaefer group, they were, Gary mentioned the cost differences. They were talking about having to spray the soybean crop 7 times for pests. It's a tropical climate. And so the incentives to be able to reduce their chemical use through biologics is much higher from a profit perspective. And then they also have sort of the potential opportunity as they develop these to potentially commercialize things in their partnership with Syngenta. And, they're not ruling out the potential for carbon markets or other sustainability opportunities to arise in Brazil. They're not there yet. They're further behind even where we are here in the US. But I would say that's just sort of a bonus. The motivation was definitely on just being able to reduce chemical use for cost control.
Did they mention, was it Asian soybean rust that they were still trying to control with those applications? And I think that's probably the case. And it would be a fungicide. Do you recall?
It was definitely fungicide. We didn't specifically.
Yeah, it was probably Asian soybean rust, which came into that nation from Africa, and that we had large concerns here in the U.S. Right at the turn of the century, right at 2000.
By the way, there's a national law that you can't plant soybeans until September 15th, and I don't know what the ending date of that is, to control items, such as fungus.
Yeah, and Gary, the difference, and I think you and I talked about this, just so those here in the United States, we do get Asian soybean rust. It generally doesn't get
up here.
Well, it does, but it doesn't get up here until late in the season. It doesn't survive very well, other than right along the coastline. So 15 degrees.
There is an advantage of having a frost.
Yes, but but my question was, how important is it that the agricultural world was able to develop soybean and corn that could be grown in these tropical
Yeah,
regions?
absolutely. That was absolutely crucial development. And Brapa was Brazilian, and Joana can wax poetically about that group was key in that. And they saw, and the major nationals also saw the opportunity in that part of the world. They saw the demand. They saw China, and we have what we have. So, but yes, developing soybeans and corn to grow in a tropical climate is a game changer.
I don't understand all of the short term in here. Will Brazil export soybean oil to the U.S. for RD? But I don't know what the RD stands for.
I think they're thinking about going to California to meet their.
Oh, renewable diesel. Right.
Yeah, I think that's already happening. I'm not sure. I don't follow that. That's a Scott question.
I haven't heard that for renewable diesel. We'll see. Let's see. And then one last question. For these large farms, how did ag tech platform tools in terms of insights, recommendations, and operational tracking come into play?
That's a Joanna question, but I would say that that's a huge deal for them. And they were using that to track more or less to track where their equipment was. And again, you got to remember that January and February period is absolutely critical. You have rains every day someplace, and you have to find a dry field. And so that's what, and get everybody there. So Joanna, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment. We should remember that the agriculture never stopped in Brazil. We don't have off season there. So they, for example, in the center west, they harvest soybean in one day, and in the same day they must to plant corn, or in the day after, because they have a short window before the dry season starts. So they track everything regarding weather, regarding weather conditions and application of the fertilizers, pesticides. For example, in Ferrarin group that we visit, they have almost 200 equipment that all of them are connected, and they can manage that in real time to see about efficiency of the equipment, the places that they should go according to the weather. So it's a huge operation around.
Well, and even things as simple as repairs. The ability to be connected and take a picture of the problem and send it somewhere, rather than potentially driving an hour or more and realizing you don't have the right tool or the right part, and then having to go an hour or more back. And time is of the essence when they're busy with field operations. And so the connectedness is a lot of bells and whistles, but a lot of kind of just basic operational efficiency stuff too, that's important for.
Well, we should wrap up. We thank you all for joining us. Gary Schnitkey, Eric Morgan, Joana Colussi, and Nick Paulson. I know you had a fantastic time on the trip. I loved following along each and every day with you. Thank you for sending the videos and the pictures so that we could use them regularly here. We did appreciate that. And Gary, if you could bring that last slide up. Folks who want to see some of this again can always see it on the FarmDoc Daily website, but there are a couple of other places within that site that it's possible to bring things up. For instance, most of this will be on YouTube, and you can go to youtube.com/@FarmDoc. You'll find these programs, the webinars, the shorts that I've produced, the shorts that Jim Baltz produced. Those are the 5-minute farm docs. And you can always get to them via farmdocdaily.illinois.edu in the archive section as well. We do appreciate you taking your time with us today. Thank you so much for being with us. Again, thanks to Gary and to Eric and Joanna and Nick as well. You have a great day. Oh, and to Jim Baltz, who's behind the scenes. Thanks, Jim. Bye-bye now.